"There's no one here for you," the station master said, not looking up from his ledger. "Nathan Cole is dead. Or close enough to it. Either way, he's not coming." Clara Whitmore stood on that platform with a single bag, a folded letter, and 43 cents to her name. The train behind her was already pulling away. She had no ticket back, no address to return to. Nothing waiting for her in any direction except wind and mountain and the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays. She tightened her coat with both hands and said very quietly, "Then I'll find the ranch myself." If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The station master finally looked up when she didn't move. He was a thick man with a gray mustache and the particular expression of someone who had delivered bad news so many times, it no longer cost him anything. He studied her the way a person studies a problem they didn't create and don't intend to solve. "You're the Cole bride?" he said. It wasn't a question. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. "I have a letter of arrangement with Nathan Cole of Cole Ridge Ranch, dated September the 14th. "I know what the letter says." He leaned back in his chair. "Doesn't change what I told you. Nathan Cole hasn't been seen in 11 days. Ranch hands say he rode out after a meeting with the land office and never came back. Sheriff sent 2 men up the ridge, found his horse, didn't find him." Clara kept her face still. She had practiced keeping her face still for most of her 24 years through her father's drinking, through the years in the textile mill, through the humiliation of answering a mail-order advertisement in a Kansas newspaper, because it was the only door left open to her. "Is there a hotel in town?" she asked. "There's a boarding house. Mrs. Ellers runs it. $2 a night." "And if a person had less than $2, he looked at her for a long moment. "Then that person would have a problem." Clara picked up her bag. "Thank you for your time." She walked out of the station into the mountain air of Ridgeback, Colorado, and stood on the main street of a town she had never seen, with 43 cents no shelter, and a name, Cole Ridge Ranch, that she had memorized from a letter written by a man who might be dead. She found the general store. She bought a heel of bread and a small wedge of hard cheese for 11 cents, which left her 32. She asked the shopkeeper, a woman with sharp eyes and a kind mouth, for directions to Cole Ridge. "That's 8 miles up the mountain road," the woman said. "Why do you want to go up there?" "I have business with the Cole family." The woman studied her. Her gaze moved to the single bag, to the thin coat, to the hands that were red from the cold. "You're the girl Nathan sent for, aren't you?" Clara didn't answer. "I heard he was missing," the woman said quietly. "I'm sorry, honey. I truly am." She paused. "You ought to know Cole Ridge isn't a soft place even on good days. And with Nathan gone, it's his brother running things now. Ethan Cole." She said the name the way people say the name of weather. Flat. Informational. Like announcing a storm. "What kind of man is he?" "The kind," the woman said carefully, "that the other men are careful around." Clara nodded once. "Thank you." She walked out and started up the mountain road. She walked for 6 hours. The road climbed steadily, winding through stands of pine and open stretches where the wind came in sideways off the higher ridges. Her shoes were not made for mountain roads. By the 3rd hour, she could feel the places where the leather had begun to fail. By the 5th hour, she stopped counting. She thought about the letter. She had read it so many times she could recite it from memory. Nathan Cole's handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the kind of effort that suggested a man who had not written many letters and wanted this one to be right. "I am looking for a woman of steady character and practical nature," he had written. "The work is hard and the land is unforgiving. But I am an honest man, and I will treat you fairly. I am not looking for romance. I am looking for a partner. If that is something you can accept, I believe we could build something decent together." She had accepted. Because decent was more than she'd had in a long time. Now Nathan Cole was gone, and she was climbing his mountain in failing shoes with 32 cents in her pocket. And somewhere above her, was a ranch being run by a man the shopkeeper had described like a weather forecast. She kept walking. She smelled the ranch before she saw it, wood smoke and horses, and the particular smell of worked earth and iron. She came around a bend in the road, and there it was. Coal Ridge Ranch, spread across a long flat shelf of mountain land, the main house and outbuildings, solid and weathered and clearly built by someone who intended to stay. There were men working in the yard. They stopped when they saw her. She walked toward them. She held herself straight. She had learned long ago that the moment you let people see your uncertainty, they make decisions for you. "I'm looking for Ethan Cole," she said. The men looked at each other. One of them, young, with a gap between his front teeth, pressed his lips together against a smile. "That'd be the boss," he said. "He's in the barn." The barn was large and smelled of hay and horse and the particular cold that settles into enclosed spaces at high altitude. She found him near the back, working over a saddle that was laid across a wooden stand. He didn't look up when she came in. She knew it was him immediately. There was something in the way he occupied space, a stillness that wasn't peace, a density that suggested a man who had made the decision a long time ago to take up as little room as possible and meant it as armor, not courtesy. He was younger than she expected, mid-30s perhaps, dark hair, several days unshaved, the kind of face that had been handsome before something happened to it. "Mr. Cole," she said. He looked up then. His eyes were gray and direct and showed no surprise, which meant someone had already told him she was on the road. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "you know who I am." Tommy rode down and back. He turned back to the saddle. "I know who you are." "Then you know why I'm here." "I know why you came," he said. "I'm less clear on why you're still here." Clara set her bag down. "Because I have nowhere else to go." That stopped him. He looked at her again, and this time the look was longer. She had the feeling he was assessing her the way he might assess a piece of equipment, not unkindly, but without sentiment. "My brother is gone," he said. "Whatever arrangement he made with you, he made it without telling me. I don't know what he promised you. I can't honor promises I don't know about." "He promised me a home and honest work," Clara said. "That's all." "He promised you marriage." "He promised me a home and honest work," she repeated. The rest was secondary. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened, shifted, like a door that doesn't open but moves slightly in its frame. "I have 12 men to feed," he said. "My cook quit 3 weeks ago, rode off with a prospector headed for New Mexico." He paused. "You said you wanted work." "I did." "Then here is what I'll offer you. 1 week. You cook, you work, you pull your weight. At the end of 1 week, I decide whether you stay or go. If you stay, we negotiate terms. If you go—" He reached into his coat pocket and placed $2 silver on the saddle stand. "That covers your train fare back to wherever you came from." Clara looked at the coins. She looked at him. "What if I can't cook?" "Then the weekend's early." "And if I can, then we talk." He picked up the saddle tool again. "Kitchen's through the main house. Fire's already lit. There's a room off the kitchen small, but you'll be warm. Men eat at 6. "It's after 4 now," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She picked up her bag and walked out of the barn. The kitchen was exactly what he'd said, a room with a fire already lit and evidence everywhere of a cook who had left in a hurry. Half-emptied sacks. A pot with something dried in the bottom. Shelves with the random remaining inventory of a pantry being slowly consumed without replenishment. She stood in the middle of it and took inventory. Salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, a bin of potatoes that were mostly good, a heel of old lard, dried onions, a jar of something that turned out to be apple butter when she opened it. She had worked in a textile mill for 6 years. She had cooked for her father and 2 brothers on a budget that would make this pantry look generous. She had done hard things in hard places with less than anyone gave her credit for. She put on the apron she found hanging on the back of the door and got to work. And at 6 o'clock, 12 men came into the main house dining room and stopped. The long table was set. Not finely, there was no fineness available, but cleanly the way someone sets a table when they understand that being fed with dignity is different from just being fed. There was a large pot of bean and salt pork stew with cornmeal dumplings. There was a skillet of fried potatoes with the dried onions worked through them. There was cornbread hot in a cast-iron pan. The men looked at the food. They looked at each other. The young one with the gap teeth, she learned later, his name was Tommy Ellers, and that his mother ran the boarding house in town, pulled out a chair, and sat down like a man sitting down to something he hadn't expected. They ate in near silence, which she took as a good sign. Men who talk through a meal aren't really tasting it. Ethan Cole sat at the head of the table. He ate without looking at her. But he ate everything on his plate, and she noticed that he paused once when he got to the dumplings in the way a person pauses when something is better than they expected. She ate in the kitchen, standing up, which was her preference when she was in someone else's space. She had learned not to take up the room she hadn't been invited to fill. After the men left, Tommy Ellers came back to the kitchen doorway. "That was the best meal this ranch has had in 4 months," he said. "Thank you," she said. "The stew, what did you put in it?" "Work," she said, "and a little apple butter in the broth." He grinned the gap-toothed grin of someone who hadn't expected to be charmed. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" "Hard places," she said, and went back to washing the pots. She lay in the small room off the kitchen that night and listened to the mountain wind move around the corners of the house. The room had one window, one hook on the wall for her coat, and a narrow bed with 2 wool blankets that smelled of cedar. It was the smallest room she had ever slept in. It was the first room she had ever slept in that was entirely hers. She folded her hands on her chest and looked up at the ceiling and thought about Nathan Cole, whom she had never met and would perhaps never find, and who had, without knowing it, done her the only decent turn of her life by writing a letter that brought her to a mountain in Colorado. She thought about Ethan Cole's gray eyes, the way he had said 1 week like it was a sentence, the way he had said it without cruelty, which she had not expected. She thought about the 2 silver dollars still sitting on that saddle stand in the barn. She had left them there. He hadn't mentioned it. She closed her eyes. She was up before 5. The fire was cold. She rebuilt it in 20 minutes, had coffee on by 5:30, and was frying salt pork and mixing cornmeal batter when she heard the first sounds of the bunkhouse stirring. Ethan Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:50. He was dressed and booted, and he stopped when he saw the fire and the coffee and the pan on the heat, and for just a moment, not long enough to be called a reaction, but long enough for her to see it, something moved across his face. "You're up early," he said. "Men work better on a hot breakfast," she said. "That's not my opinion. That's just true." He poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the doorframe. He drank it and watched her work with the same assessing quality she'd noticed in the barn. Not intrusive, not warm, just present. "How'd you sleep?" he asked. "Fine." "Room warm enough?" "Yes." A pause. "You left the money in the barn." "I know." "Why?" She turned the pork in the pan. "Because I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Cole, and I didn't want you to think I was considering it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're confident for someone who's been here less than 12 hours." "No," she said. "I'm not confident. I'm decided. Those are different things." She glanced at him. "Confidence is about what you believe will happen. Being decided is about what you intend to do regardless." He looked at her over his coffee cup. That same quality of attention, like something behind the gray eyes, was doing math she couldn't see. "Breakfast is at 6, she said. "You might want to let the men know it'll be hot this morning." He put the cup down. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, not mocking, not warm, just slightly different from the way he'd said anything the night before. Like a door that had moved another inch. He walked out. She heard him cross the main room and go out the front door, and a moment later, she heard his voice low and carrying in the cold morning air, calling the men in for breakfast. Come. She survived the week by working. This was not a strategy she had invented. It was simply the only thing she had ever known to work. When circumstances were beyond her control, she controlled what she could. The quality of the fire, the timing of the meals, the cleanliness of the kitchen, the small dignities she could extend to men who were more accustomed to being fed than cared for. She learned their names. Tommy Ellers, the youngest, who asked her questions and brought her firewood without being asked. Hector Reyes, the foreman, a compact and serious man of 40, who ran the ranch hands with an economy of words and watched Clara in her first days with the particular caution of a man responsible for his employer's interests. Big Bill Marsh, who said almost nothing but cleaned his plate 3 times at every meal, and once left a handful of pine cones outside her kitchen door, which she eventually understood was his version of flowers. Old Pete Caldwell, who had been at Coal Ridge for 11 years and claimed to remember when Ethan was a boy who used to race his horse along the Ridge Road. It was old Pete who first told her about what had broken Ethan Cole. He didn't mean to. It came out sideways, the way things come out when men who've kept quiet for a long time get comfortable enough to be careless. They were sitting in the kitchen after the evening meal. She'd started letting Pete eat in the kitchen after she noticed he had trouble with the bench seating at the long table, though she never said this aloud, and she'd given him the last of the cornbread and a second cup of coffee, and he was warm and fed, and somewhere between satisfied and sentimental. "You remind me of his wife," Pete said. And then he stopped like a man who'd stepped on ground he hadn't meant to step on. She looked at him steadily. "I didn't know he'd been married." 8 years ago, Pete said after a moment. "Margaret, good woman, real good." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She died in the second winter. Fever came through, took her and the baby both." He shook his head. "He hasn't been the same since. Most people, they grieve, and then they find a way back. Ethan..." He paused. Ethan decided grieving was the only honest thing left and made himself a home in it. Clara was quiet. "He's not a bad man," Pete said. "He's just a man who made up his mind that caring about things was a losing proposition. You understand, he's not cold. He's just protecting himself from more loss by not letting anything get close enough to be lost." "And Nathan?" she asked carefully. Pete's expression changed. Nathan was the opposite. Nathan let everything in. Every stray dog, every passing stranger, every... He stopped. "That's probably why he sent for you." He looked at her. "And probably why Ethan doesn't know what to do with the fact that you're here." She nodded slowly. She looked down at her hands on the table. "Do you think Nathan is alive?" Pete was quiet for a long moment. "I think," he said carefully, "that there are people who would benefit from Nathan Cole being gone." She looked up. "I've already said more than I should," he said. He pushed back from the table and stood up, his joints announcing themselves. "That was the best cornbread I've had since my mother made it, and she's been gone 30 years. He went out. Clara sat in the kitchen with the fire crackling, and Pete's words sitting in her chest like stones dropped into still water, the ripples going outward and not stopping. There are people who would benefit from Nathan Cole being gone. She thought about the land office. She thought about the letter Nathan had written her, careful and deliberate, a man building something decent. She thought about Ethan, 8 years in grief, like a house with all the windows shut. She got up and started the bread for the next morning. On the 6th day, Hector Reyes came to her with news she hadn't been looking for. He found her in the kitchen at midday and closed the door behind him, which was unusual enough that she put down what she was doing and gave him her full attention. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to know I'm telling you because Pete trusts you and Pete's judgment is good." "All right. There was a man in town this morning, came up from the county seat. Name is Dillard, Gerald Dillard." He watched her face to see if the name meant anything. It didn't. "He's a land agent. Works for a company out of Denver that's been buying up ranch land in this county for 2 years. They make their offers. If you accept, good. If you don't..." He shook his head slightly. "The ranches start having problems. Fences cut, cattle gone missing, water rights challenged in court." He paused. 3 families sold last year. Nobody wanted to. One of them, old Harlan Griggs, told the sheriff Dillard had threatened his wife directly. Sheriff wrote it in his report, and nothing happened. Clara said, and Cole Ridge. Nathan refused him 4 months ago, wouldn't sell a blade of grass. Hector's jaw tightened. 2 weeks after that, Nathan rode out to the land office for a meeting and didn't come back. The kitchen was very quiet. Does Ethan know this? She asked. Ethan knows Dillard exists. He doesn't know about the meeting. Nathan didn't tell him. Hector paused. Nathan didn't tell Ethan a lot of things because Nathan knew Ethan would. He stopped. Ethan's response to threats is not legal or measured. Nathan was trying to protect his brother. By protecting him from the truth. Yes. Clara thought for a moment. Why are you telling me? Hector looked at her steadily. Because Dillard is coming here tomorrow, he said. I heard it in town. He's coming to make a new offer, and he knows about you. What does he know about me? He knows Nathan sent for a mail-order bride. He knows Nathan's gone. And I think he's going to try to use your position here to pressure Ethan. He paused. A woman with no legal standing, no family, no official connection to the ranch. She's a vulnerability. Dillard knows how to find vulnerabilities. Clara was very still. I thought you should know, Hector said, before tomorrow. He nodded once and went out. Clara stood in the kitchen and looked at the fire. She thought about the word vulnerability. She thought about how her entire life had been made of vulnerabilities. No money, no family, no standing, no claim on anything, and how she had learned to move through the world by making those vulnerabilities irrelevant through the one thing nobody could take from her. Work. Steadiness. The refusal to be moved by the expectation that she would break. She thought about what Pete had said. There are people who would benefit from Nathan Cole being gone. She reached a decision. She went to find Ethan Cole. He was at the fence line on the north pasture repairing a section that had come down in the last wind. She walked out to him across the frozen ground, and he heard her coming and turned, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw her walking toward him with her jaw set and her eyes direct was something she hadn't seen on him before. Surprise, possibly. And something underneath the surprise that she didn't try to name. We need to talk, she said. He looked at her for a moment. He set down the fence tool. He gave her his full attention, which she was learning was the way Ethan Cole showed respect not through words or warmth, but through the quality of his listening. She told him everything. Hector's information, the land agent, the meeting Nathan had attended, the pattern of what had happened to other ranches that refused to sell. Ethan listened without moving, without interrupting, without his expression giving her anything to read. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she began to wonder if she'd misjudged the situation entirely. Then he said, Nathan knew all of this. I believe so. And he didn't tell me. I believe he was trying to prevent you from doing something that would land you in a jail cell or worse. Another silence. Something moved behind his eyes, not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both. Who else knows? He asked. Hector, Pete, I think. Probably more of the men than you'd guess. And Dillard is coming tomorrow. That's what Hector heard. Ethan picked up the fence tool and set it down again, a gesture of a man in the brief physical negotiation between action and stillness. He's going to say something about you, Ethan said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes, she said. He's going to use the fact that I'm here the way I'm here, what I am in the eyes of the law, as a lever, to embarrass you, to suggest the ranch isn't being run properly, to question the legitimacy of who's making decisions. Ethan looked at her. Does that frighten you? She met his eyes. No, she said honestly. I've been called worse things than what he's going to call me, and I've survived worse positions than this one. She paused. What I need to know is what you intend to do. About Dillard. About all of it. She held his gaze. Because if you're going to send me away before he arrives, if having me here complicates things in a way that isn't worth it, I'd rather know now than learn it tomorrow in front of an audience. The wind came across the pasture and moved between them and kept going. Ethan Cole looked at her for a long time, long enough that the silence stopped being uncomfortable and became something else, a space in which two people were figuring out what was true. "You've been here 6 days," he said. "Yes. And in 6 days..." He stopped. He seemed to be choosing words with the care of a man who didn't use them often, and had learned to spend them carefully. "In 6 days you've fed 12 men better than they've been fed in months. You've been here every morning before the sun, and every night after everyone else is in. Nobody asked you to. Nobody told you to." He paused. "Pete told me what you said to him about confidence and being decided." She hadn't known Pete had passed that along. "I'm not sending you away," Ethan said. "Not before Dillard comes. Not after." He picked up the fence tool again and turned back to the fence. Then he stopped with his back to her and said without turning, "The 1-week deadline was yesterday." She waited. "I forgot to address it," he said. "I think that means you're staying." He went back to work on the fence. Clara stood in the cold for a moment, looking at his back. Something in her chest did something complicated that she elected not to examine closely. She turned and walked back toward the ranch house. The bread needed to go in before dark. And tomorrow, Gerald Dillard was coming. Gerald Dillard arrived at Coal Ridge Ranch at 9:30 in the morning, and he arrived the way men like him always arrive, with enough people around him to suggest authority and enough politeness in his voice to make the threat harder to name. There were 2 men with him. Not ranch hands, not deputies. The kind of men who stand slightly behind someone and slightly apart from each other, positioned the way furniture is positioned when the furniture is meant to discourage certain movements. Clara heard the horses from the kitchen. She dried her hands on her apron and didn't go to the window. She went to the stove and checked the coffee, and waited because she had decided the night before that she would not be found hovering or watching or anything that looked like fear. Ethan was already in the yard when Dillard dismounted. She knew this because she heard his voice, that low, uninflected voice that gave nothing away, say, "Mr. Dillard, Mr. Cole." Dillard's voice was different, warmer than it had any reason to be. The warmth of a man who had practiced making his voice do what his face couldn't quite manage. "I appreciate you receiving me. I know you're a busy man." "I am," Ethan said. "What do you want?" A brief pause, the pause of a man recalibrating, finding a man less pliable than he'd accounted for. "I'd like to talk business. Inside if you're willing. It's cold out here." "We can talk here." Another pause, longer. "All right." Dillard's voice shifted slightly, the warmth adjusting itself. "I expect you know why I've come. The offer I made your brother 4 months ago still stands. In fact, I've been authorized to improve it, considerably." "My brother isn't here." "No," Dillard said. "He isn't. Which is part of what I wanted to discuss." Clara moved to the kitchen doorway. She couldn't see the yard from there, but she could hear everything, and she stood with her shoulder against the doorframe and listened with her whole body. "My brother's absence," Ethan said, "is not a business matter. With respect, Mr. Cole, it may affect the legal standing of certain arrangements tied to this property. There are questions about succession, about who has authority to make decisions regarding Coal Ridge." A pause. "I'm not raising these questions to be difficult. I'm raising them because they exist, and I'd rather you hear them from me than from a county judge." "Is that a threat?" "It's information." The warmth was entirely gone now. What replaced it was something clean and hard, the sound of a man who had gotten tired of the performance. "Look, Cole, I'm going to be straight with you. The company I represent is going to have this land. It can happen easily, good money, clean transfer. You walk away with something. Or it can happen through the courts, which takes longer and costs more, and generally ends the same way, except that you've lost years and legal fees on top of the land itself." He paused. "I'd rather you walk away with something." Ethan said nothing. "There's also the matter," Dillard continued, and here his voice shifted again, a different kind of shift, quieter, more precise, like a man picking up a different tool, "of the woman. Clara's hands were still at her sides. "The woman," Ethan said. "The mail-order bride. The one Nathan sent for before his absence. I understand she's taken up residence on the property." A pause measured in inches. "I mention it only because it complicates things legally. A woman with no formal marriage, no family connection, no legal standing residing on property with contested succession, that's the kind of situation that attracts attention. Questions about the nature of the arrangement, about who invited her and under what terms." Another pause, each one more deliberate than the last. "It could become unpleasant, for her specifically." Ethan said, "Come inside." Clara straightened. Not what she had expected. She heard boots on the porch steps, and she moved back to the stove and had the coffee poured before the door opened. Ethan came in first. He looked at her once, a direct, brief look that said several things at once, none of which she had words for yet, and then Dillard came in behind him, and Dillard's two men stayed on the porch, which Ethan had clearly required, because one of them looked like he'd been told to stay the way a dog is told to stay. Dillard was about 50. Well-dressed for the mountains, which meant his clothes were expensive and wrong for the climate. He had a broad, florid face, and the eyes of a man who had spent decades calculating the distance between what people were willing to accept and what they weren't. He saw Clara and stopped. Not for long. Half a second maybe. But she'd been waiting for it. "This is Miss Whitmore," Ethan said. His voice was level. "She runs the kitchen and assists with the management of the household." He pulled out a chair and sat down, which meant Dillard had to sit too, which meant Ethan had just put himself at the head of a table in his own house and put a guest in a guest's position, and the whole thing was done so naturally that Dillard was seated before he'd processed what had happened. "Coffee, Mr. Dillard?" Clara asked. He looked at her. The calculation in his eyes was not subtle. He was measuring her, her clothes, her posture, her presence in this kitchen, what it meant, and what it could be made to mean. "Thank you," he said. She poured it and put the cup in front of him and moved back to the stove where she could hear everything and be seen by both of them. "You were saying something about Miss Whitmore," Ethan said. Dillard picked up his coffee. "I was noting the legal complexity of her position here." "Her position here," Ethan said, "is that she's employed at Coal Ridge Ranch. Has been for the past week. Is that legally complex?" "The nature of her original arrangement is concluded," Ethan said. "Nathan's arrangement is separate from her employment here. Those are two different things, and if someone tried to argue otherwise in front of a judge, I'd be interested to know what law they plan to cite." Dillard's eyes moved to Clara and back to Ethan. "You're an intelligent man, Cole, so I'm going to speak plainly." He set the coffee down. "The company I represent has interests in this county that extend beyond Coal Ridge. Cooperation is rewarded. Resistance becomes expensive. I've seen families hold out, fight it in court, refuse every offer, and I've watched them lose the land anyway, plus everything they spent fighting for it. Their children saw it happen. Their wives." He let that sit. "I'm not a villain in this story. I'm the man who's offering you an exit that leaves you with your dignity and a substantial sum of money. The alternative is a process that will involve scrutiny of every aspect of this operation, its finances, its legal arrangements, its residents." The last word landed the way he intended it to. Clara said from the stove, "Mr. Dillard?" Both men looked at her. She kept her voice even. "How did Nathan Cole's meeting with the land office go 4 months ago?" The room went quiet in a way that was different from silence. Dillard looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face, a tiny recalculation, the adjustment of a man who has just realized a variable he'd dismissed is more significant than he thought. "I'm not sure I know what meeting you're referring to," he said. "The one Nathan attended at the county land office in September. The one he rode out to and didn't ride back from." She held his gaze without effort. "I ask because I'd imagine the land office would have records of who attended that meeting and what was discussed. I'd imagine the sheriff's report about Nathan's disappearance would reference those records if anyone thought to look." Dillard set his coffee cup down with the careful precision of a man making sure his hands don't show what they're doing. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice very calm. I'd encourage you to be careful about making suggestions you can't support." "I haven't made any suggestions," she said. "I asked a question about a meeting. That's all." Ethan was very still. He was watching Dillard, the way a man watches something he's been trying to identify finally become clear. "I think," Dillard said, standing, "we've reached the end of what can be accomplished today." He looked at Ethan. "I'll give you time to consider. The offer is open for 30 days. He paused. "I'd use them." He walked out. The door closed. They heard the horses leave the yard. The kitchen was absolutely still. Ethan looked at Clara. The look was long and layered, the kind that comes from a man who has just watched someone do something he hadn't predicted and is still catching up to what he saw. "You knew," he said. "I suspected," she said. "Hector told me about the meeting. I wanted to see his face when I mentioned it." "And what did you see?" She turned back to the stove. "A man who knows exactly what happened at that meeting, and who hadn't expected anyone here to know it existed." Ethan rode to town that afternoon. He didn't tell her he was going. She knew because she heard his horse and looked up and saw the direction he was riding. He was back before dark, and when he came into the kitchen, he stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Which she had begun to understand meant there was something he was organizing before he said it. "I talked to the sheriff," he said. She waited. He's a careful man. Careful in the way that means he's aware of which way the wind blows, and he doesn't ride against it. Ethan came in and sat down at the kitchen table, not the dining room, the kitchen table, the smaller one where Pete ate his meals. This was new. He confirmed there was a meeting at the land office in September. 3 men attended: Nathan, a land office clerk, and a representative of the Denver company. The clerk's notes from that meeting have apparently gone missing from the files. "Missing?" she said. "Filed incorrectly," the sheriff said. The flatness of his voice carried the weight of everything he thought about that explanation. "Nathan's name is in the meeting log. That's all that's left." Clara turned this over. "Dillard was at that meeting. The representative isn't named in the log, just company representative." He was quiet for a moment. Nathan was not a man who backed down from things. He would have pushed back hard. He stopped, started again. He would have said something that made him a problem. "And problems get solved," she said quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I should have known." He'd been different in the weeks before, quieter, kept going over the deed documents late at night. I thought he was just... He stopped again. "He didn't want to worry you," Clara said. "He knew what I'd do," Ethan said, and the way he said it told her exactly what Nathan had been afraid of. Not that Ethan wouldn't fight, that Ethan would, and that the fighting would destroy him. She sat down across from him. This was also new. She had not sat at any table with him before, always moving, always working, always in motion. "Ethan," she said. First time she'd used his name without the formal prefix. She saw him register it. "What do you need to do?" He looked at her. "The deed," he said. "If there's any legal irregularity in it, any opening Dillard's company could exploit, they'll use it. I need a lawyer, a real one, not the county man who works for whoever pays him most." He paused. "There's a man in Denver, Daniel Hart. Nathan mentioned him once. Said he was the only honest attorney in 3 counties. Then you need to get him up here. Getting him up here costs money I'm not sure I have readily available. Then send a letter first. Explain the situation. A good lawyer will know whether this is worth his travel before you spend anything." She paused. "And you should look at every document related to this ranch deed, water rights, any agreements Nathan made in the last year. If Dillard is going to attack the legal standing of Coal Ridge, you want to know the ground before he does." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "You know about land law. I know about being in a vulnerable position and needing to know exactly where you stand before someone else defines it for you." She met his eyes. "I've been in that position most of my life, Mr. Cole. You learn to read the terrain." Something shifted in his face. Not softened. It was never quite softening with him, but opened slightly. The way a window opens a matter of inches enough to change what comes through. "Ethan," he said. She looked at him. "You used my name an hour ago," he said. "Don't go back to formal now." She almost smiled. "All right." He pushed back from the table and stood up. "I'll write the letter tonight. And tomorrow, I want to go through Nathan's documents. He kept everything in the study. I haven't touched the room since he left." He paused, and for just a moment she saw the cost of that admission. Not just tactical, not just legal. Personal. The room of a man he was still waiting to come home. "I'd like you there." Second pair of eyes. "Yes," she said. "Of course." He nodded once and walked out. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a long moment after he left. She thought about Dillard's face when she'd asked about the meeting. She thought about the careful measuring look Ethan had given her afterward, the recalibration she'd watched happen behind his gray eyes. She thought about old Pete's voice quiet in this same kitchen. "He's not cold. He's just protecting himself from more loss by not letting anything get close enough to be lost." She got up and started the bread for morning. Dr. McRae. Nathan's study told a story. It wasn't the disorder of a man who'd left in a hurry. Nathan, she was learning through his traces, was methodical and careful and organized the way people are when they've learned that the world doesn't give you second chances to find things. The room was ordered. That was what made it frightening. An ordered room left by a man who intended to return and had not. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment before he walked in. Clara went in ahead of him, giving him the small grace of not watching his face. She started on the left side of the desk. He started on the right. They worked in silence, which between them had become a comfortable thing, a shared language of two people who understood that not everything needs to be spoken to be communicated. The deed was in the top drawer as Ethan expected. He read it carefully and passed it to her without comment. She read it, and then she read it again because something in the second paragraph felt like it mattered in a way she couldn't immediately place. "This language here," she said, pointing, "about succession of ownership in the event of the death or permanent incapacitation of the primary holder ownership reverts to the surviving family member of legal majority. That's standard, isn't it?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Why?" "Because Nathan isn't confirmed dead. He's missing. Those are legally different." She looked up at him. "If Dillard wanted to challenge your authority over Coal Ridge, he couldn't do it through a death claim. He'd have to have Nathan legally declared dead, which takes time and requires—" "A judge," Ethan said. His voice had gone flat and sharp at the same time. "A county judge." "Who might be persuaded," she said quietly. "Or pressured." They looked at each other. "He's moving faster than I thought," Ethan said. "He came here the day after Hector heard he was in town," she said. "He wasn't going to give you time to prepare. He wanted to see the lay of the land, what we knew, what we didn't, how you'd react." She set the deed down. "He didn't expect you to bring him inside and sit him down at your table, and he didn't expect me to ask about the September meeting." "You bought us time," Ethan said. "A little." She paused. "Has there been any communication with a judge? Any papers filed that you know of?" "Nothing served to me." "That doesn't mean nothing's been filed. Hector needs to go to the county seat. Someone we trust needs to check the court filings." She looked at the deed again. "And we need Daniel Hart up here as soon as he can come." Ethan was quiet. Then, "You said we." She looked up. He was watching her with that quality of attention she'd learned to recognize not a test, but a real question. "I did," she said simply. Another silence, not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that has weight and content, the kind that says more than words would. "Bottom drawer," Ethan said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not warmth exactly, but the sound of warmth at a distance, moving closer with care. "There's a file Nathan labeled Correspondence. I haven't opened it yet." She opened it. Inside was a series of letters neatly folded. She unfolded the first one and read it, and then she held very still. And Ethan, watching her face, said, "What is it?" She turned it so he could see. It was a letter from the Denver company dated 8 months ago, offering to purchase Coal Ridge for a figure that was substantial but not generous. Nathan had written his refusal in the margin in pencil, not for sale, not at any price. Do not contact me again. Read the second one, she said. He did. His face went through several things she watched without interrupting. The second letter was from Daniel Hart, attorney at Law Denver. It was dated 6 weeks before Nathan disappeared. It was a response to a letter Nathan had clearly sent him. Dear Mr. Cole, it read, the situation you describe is consistent with a pattern of land acquisition I have been investigating in your county and 2 adjacent ones. I believe your instinct to document everything is correct. I am gathering evidence from other affected ranches, and I believe a case can be made before the State Land Commission. I would urge you to be careful. The men behind this are not unfamiliar with making problems disappear. Please write again when you can. I am on your side in this. Ethan set the letter down. The room was very quiet. Nathan knew, Ethan said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Something that was grief and anger mixed together until they were indistinguishable. He was already working with Hart. He was building a case. He stopped. He was protecting you, Clara said. And the ranch, both at once. Ethan stood up and walked to the window. He stood with his back to her for a long moment. She gave him the silence he needed. She had learned when silence was a gift. When he turned back around, his face was composed in the particular way of a man who has decided what he feels can wait. Write to Hart today, he said. Tell him we have Nathan's correspondence. Tell him Dillard has been here and what he said. Tell him, he paused. Tell him Nathan's brother is ready to finish what Nathan started. I'll have it ready by noon, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, why are you doing this? The question was direct and quiet and completely without performance. The kind of question a man asks when he genuinely wants to know and has run out of patience for anything indirect. Because it's right, she said. That's not all of it. She considered him. Because this ranch is worth saving. Because Nathan wrote me a letter that treated me like a person worth writing to, and I owe him something for that. She paused. And because I told you I was decided. And I meant it. He held her gaze for a long moment. I'll tell Hector to ride to the county seat today, he said. Check the court filings. He started for the door, and then he stopped, and without turning fully, he said, Clara. She waited. Whatever Dillard tries to say about you, about why you're here, what your standing is, what you are in the eyes of the law. He turned just enough for her to see his profile. He doesn't get to define that. Nobody does except you. A pause. I should have said that yesterday, when he was still in the room. She felt something shift in her chest, something old and defended something she'd built walls around a long time ago and stopped checking on. You said it now, she said. He nodded once and walked out. She sat in Nathan Cole's ordered waiting study and listened to the sound of the ranch continuing its work around her, and she picked up a pen and began to write to Daniel Hart. She wrote the truth. All of it. What had happened, what they had found, what was coming. She wrote it cleanly and carefully, the way you write when the stakes are real, and there is no room for anything except exactly what matters. Outside, she heard Ethan's voice in the yard, giving Hector his instructions. And she heard Hector's horse leave at a trot, heading toward the county road, and she kept writing. The letter took her 40 minutes. She sealed it and put Ethan's name at the bottom, alongside her own, not from sentiment, but because a letter from 2 people is harder to ignore than a letter from 1, and she set it on the corner of Nathan's desk where Ethan would see it. Then she went back to the kitchen. Because the men needed to eat at 6, and the ground beneath Coal Ridge Ranch was shifting in ways that would require every one of them to be strong, and strength starts with being fed. Hector came back from the county seat on the 3rd day, and Clara knew from the sound of his horse fast, not the measured trot of a man returning with nothing, that what he'd found mattered. She was in the kitchen when he rode in. She heard Ethan cross the yard to meet him, heard their voices low and urgent, and she dried her hands and waited. Not hovering. Waiting. There was a difference, and she had always understood it. Ethan came inside 3 minutes later. He came directly to the kitchen, which told her everything about how far things had shifted between them in the past week. They filed, he said. She set down the pot she was holding. Already. 4 days ago. Before Dillard even came here. He pulled out the kitchen chair and sat down hard. Petition to the county judge requesting a formal declaration of abandonment of Coal Ridge Ranch on the grounds that the primary deed holder is missing and no legal successor has been formally established. He looked at her. Not death, abandonment. That's the language they used. Abandonment, she repeated, turning the word over. That's deliberate. A death claim requires a body or a waiting period. Abandonment is faster. If the judge agrees that the ranch has been effectively abandoned, he can order a receivership, appoint an administrator. Ethan's voice was flat and controlled, the flatness of a man holding something down by will. And the administrator would be named by the petitioner. Dillard's company. Yes. Clara sat down across from him. She thought for a moment. When is the hearing? 19 days. 19 days. She calculated what that meant. Time enough for Daniel Hart to travel from Denver if he came quickly. Time enough to build something. Not much, but enough if they moved without wasting a single one of those days. Has Hart responded to the letter? She asked. Not yet. I sent a writer this morning with a second letter, more urgent. I told him about the filing. Good. She looked at him. Ethan, the abandonment claim it only holds if the ranch appears unmanaged, unclaimed, operating without proper authority. If you can demonstrate continuous operation, active management, documented decision-making. I know, he said. He rubbed one hand across his jaw. But there's a problem. He paused and she could see him deciding how to say it. The deed lists Nathan as primary holder, myself as secondary in the event of Nathan's incapacity or death. But incapacity and absence are not the same legal category. I've been running this ranch for 6 weeks and technically, I don't have formal succession authority until Nathan is declared legally unavailable, which requires a court ruling, she said, which will be made by the same judge Dillard's company petitioned. She was quiet for a moment. Then, who is the judge? Harlan Moss, county circuit judge, been on the bench 9 years. Does Pete know him? Ethan blinked. The question had clearly surprised him. Pete knows everyone in this county. He's been here longer than most of the buildings. Ask him tonight, she said. What kind of man is Judge Moss? Whether he's bought or whether he's just careful, which is different. She paused. There's a difference between a man who takes money and a man who reads the wind. A man who reads the wind can be shown which direction to look. Ethan studied her. You think like a lawyer. I think like a woman who's had to navigate systems that weren't built in her favor, she said. Same skill set, less schooling. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one, the kind that passes through a man's expression when something catches him off guard, and he doesn't have a defense prepared in time. I'll talk to Pete, he said. Pete's assessment of Harlan Moss came out that evening over the last of the coffee, and it was the most useful thing anyone had said in 3 days. Moss is not a bad man, Pete said, turning his cup in his hands with the slow deliberateness of a man who has seen the world long enough to know that accuracy matters more than speed. He's not bought. I want to be clear about that. He's not in Dillard's pocket. He paused. But he's cautious. He's a man who goes the way the evidence points and doesn't look too hard at who arranged the evidence. He looked at Ethan. If Dillard's company presents a clean legal petition with supporting documents, Moss will grant it. Not because he's corrupt, because the paperwork is in order and nobody credible has told him it isn't. Then we need to be the credible voice, Clara said from across the table. Pete looked at her. You'd need Hart, a lawyer with standing. Moss won't dismiss a professional petition based on the word of the rancher whose land is at stake. That's just a man defending his property, and Moss has seen that before." He paused. "But a Denver attorney with a documented case, that's different. That's a counter-narrative. Moss can follow that direction as easily as any other." "Hart needs to come," Ethan said. "He needs to come fast," Clara said. The writer Ethan had sent to Denver returned 6 days later. Not with a letter. With Daniel Hart himself, who rode into Coal Ridge in the mid-afternoon on a horse that had been pushed hard, and who climbed down in the yard looking like a man who had decided that some things were urgent enough to skip the correspondence stage. He was about 60. Lean with the kind of lean that comes from decades of a life lived at pace. Sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who listen for a living, complete, immediate, the kind that makes the person being listened to feel both seen and slightly accountable. He shook Ethan's hand in the yard. Then he looked at Clara, who had come out to the porch. "You're the woman who wrote the letter," he said. "I helped write it," she said. "The second half was better than the first," he said, which was not what she expected, and she found herself recalibrating her read of him entirely. Clearer, more specific about the timeline. He turned to Ethan. "I've been building a case against Dillard's company for 14 months. 3 other ranches, 2 of which sold under pressure, and 1 of which is in the same legal position you're in now. Your brother's letter to me 6 weeks before his disappearance is the most significant piece of evidence I have. I need to see everything in that study." "Tonight," Ethan said. "Tonight," Hart agreed. "Yeah." They worked in Nathan's study until past midnight, the 3 of them with the fire burning low, and documents spread across every surface. Hart read with a speed that suggested he wasn't reading for the first time. He was confirming, cross-referencing, finding where what he already knew connected to what he was seeing. He was the one who found it. It was in the correspondence file near the bottom. A letter Nathan had written, but apparently never sent a draft, unsealed, folded once, and placed between 2 other documents, as though he'd set it aside intending to return to it. Hart read it and said, "Mr. Cole." Ethan looked up. "Your brother didn't just refuse to sell," Hart said, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who has just found the center of something. "He was documenting. He was collecting." He turned the letter so they could see it. "This is a record. Names, dates, amounts." He'd spoken to 2 other ranchers, Harlan Griggs, and a man named Burl Caffey, who had told him directly what they'd been threatened with. He'd written it down. Every word. He looked at Ethan. "This is witness testimony. In Nathan's handwriting, dated and specific. In a court proceeding, this is evidence." "Would it be admissible?" Clara asked. "He's not here to testify. In a land commission hearing, which is where this case belongs, not a county court, the evidentiary standards are different, and I have corroborating witnesses. Griggs and Caffey both talked to me separately. They'll talk to the commission." Hart set the letter down. "Dillard thinks he's fighting a property dispute in a county court in front of a judge he's familiar with. I'm going to move to transfer jurisdiction to the State Land Commission. That's a different arena entirely. Different rules. And Dillard's company has a significant problem there. 3 complaints already filed, all in various stages of review." He paused. "When I add Coal Ridge and Nathan Cole's documentation and the timeline of his disappearance, that's no longer a property dispute. That's a pattern. And a pattern is a much more serious thing." Ethan was very still. Clara recognized the quality of his stillness. Now it wasn't absence. It was the stillness of a man containing something large. "Can you get the jurisdiction transferred before the county hearing in 19 days? He asked. 13, Hart said. "I need to file in Denver, get the transfer order, and have it served to the county court before they convene. It's tight, but it's possible." He paused. "Provided nothing interferes." "Meaning Dillard," Clara said. "Meaning Dillard finds out what we're doing." Hart looked at her directly. "The moment he knows I'm here and what I'm filing, he will apply pressure wherever he thinks pressure will work. That means this ranch. That means its operation. That means—" His eyes moved briefly to Clara and back to Ethan. "The people connected to it." "Say it plainly," Ethan said. He will use Miss Whitmore, Hart said. He mentioned her when he came here, I assume? He did, Clara said. Then he's already identified formal legal standing on the property present under an informal arrangement tied to a missing man. If he can force her removal, he disrupts the operation of the ranch. If he can publicly question her character or her reasons for being here, he creates a narrative that damages your credibility in front of a judge. Hart's voice was precise and without cruelty. I'm telling you this, not to alarm either of you, but because you need to know what's coming, and it needs to be addressed before he gets there. A silence settled over the study. Ethan looked at Clara. She looked back at him. What would address it? Ethan asked. He was asking Hart, but he was looking at her. Formal employment documentation, Hart said. Signed, dated, witnessed. Clear terms of her position here. That establishes legal standing independent of Nathan's original arrangement. He paused. And depending on how aggressive Dillard becomes, there are other arrangements that would provide more comprehensive standing, but those are decisions only the two of you can make. Neither of them responded to the second part. Hart gathered the documents into a careful pile. I'll sleep and leave at first light. I need to be in Denver within 4 days. I'll send word when the transfer is filed. He looked at Ethan. Don't let Dillard on this property again without me present. And if anyone from the county court arrives with papers, do not sign anything. Send for me immediately. Understood, Ethan said. Hart stood and shook Ethan's hand, and then turned and shook Clara's, which was not what men of his generation typically did, and which she noticed. He left the study. Ethan and Clara were alone in Nathan's room, surrounded by the evidence of a man's careful, systematic effort to protect everything he loved. Employment papers, Ethan said. I'll have Hart draw them up before he leaves. That's sensible, she said. He looked at her. Clara. She waited. The other thing he mentioned. He said it carefully. Not the way a man says something to pressure, but the way a man says something because he's decided to be honest, even when honesty costs him composure. I'm not raising it as I'm not suggesting that you owe me anything, or that circumstances require you to. He stopped, and the stopping was so unlike him, so contrary to the economy and directness that defined him, that it told her more than any completed sentence would have. I know, she said gently. He nodded. He looked down at the desk for a moment. Good night, Clara. Good night, Ethan. She walked out of the study and through the quiet house and into her small room off the kitchen, and she lay down on her narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about a man who built walls out of grief and was standing at the edge of one of them looking over, deciding whether to step back or keep going. She thought about herself, about what she was deciding too. 3 days after Hart left, the first act of interference arrived. It came in the form of 2 men from the county, not deputies, not anything official, just men with a letter on county stationery claiming a routine inspection of the property's water rights, which was the kind of claim that sounded administrative and was designed to establish a presence and look for anything that could be turned into a legal problem. Ethan met them at this gate. Clara heard his voice from the kitchen level, cold, absolutely immovable. You're not coming on this property without a warrant, and my attorney present, he said. If the county has a legitimate concern about Coleridge's water rights file, it properly, and will respond through the correct channels. Until then, this is private land, and you're on the wrong side of the fence. One of the men said something she couldn't hear. Ethan said, Try it. Just those 2 words. She didn't need to see his face. The men left. She went to the doorway and watched Ethan walk back across the yard. His face was contained and hard, but when he saw her in the doorway, his expression shifted, not softened, but adjusted the way a man adjusts when the person he's most honest with is watching. They're probing, he said. I know. They want to see how you respond, whether you'll overreact or back down. She paused. You were exactly right. He came up the porch steps and stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly. You're keeping count, he said. Times I do things right. Somebody should, she said. He was very still for a moment. She could see something in his eyes, not the gray distance she'd seen in the first days, but something less guarded. Something that was making decisions about how guarded it still needed to be. Then Tommy Ellers came around the corner of the house at a jog, and the moment passed. "Boss," Tommy said, slightly out of breath. "Rider coming up the road. Don't recognize the horse." Ethan turned. "How many?" "Just the one." They watched together. The rider came up the road at a steady pace and resolved as he got closer into a young man neither of them recognized who pulled up at the gate and held up a folded paper. "Letter for Mr. Ethan Cole," he said. "From Mr. Daniel Hart, Denver." Ethan crossed the yard and took it. He opened it standing there and read it, and Clara watched his face move through something she couldn't entirely interpret. He walked back to her and held out the letter. She read it. Hart had filed the transfer petition. The State Land Commission had received it, and they had done something Hart hadn't anticipated. They had accelerated the timeline. The commission, he wrote, had been building a case against Dillard's company for months, and had been waiting for a filing exactly like this one to provide grounds for a formal investigation. The county hearing in 19 days had been superseded by a commission hearing in Denver 12 days from the date of the letter. 12 days. "He did it," she said. "He did it," Ethan said. "But that's not the part I want you to read." She looked further down the page. Hart had added a final paragraph in a slightly different hand, as though written after the main letter was finished. It said, "One more thing. A man answering Nathan Cole's description was seen 6 weeks ago in Laramie, Wyoming, by a contact of mine who knows the Cole family by reputation. He appeared to be in some difficulty, but was alive. I am making inquiries. Do not lose hope." Clara read it twice. She looked up at Ethan. His face had done something she had not seen it do before. Not broken, nothing as dramatic as that, but opened the way a fist opens when the thing it's been gripping is finally carefully set down. "He's alive," she said. "Maybe," Ethan said. His voice was rough. "Maybe." "That's enough," she said. "Maybe is enough to work with." He nodded. He looked away from her out toward the ridge, and she gave him that. She understood the kind of feeling that needs to be looked at sideways. Tommy was watching from across the yard with the discretion of a young man who had learned enough to know when to be very busy with something else. Big Bill Marsh was mending harness on the fence, not looking up. Old Pete had appeared on the bunkhouse porch and stood quietly, and when Clara glanced at him, he met her eyes and nodded once, a slow and weighted nod that said he'd been holding this particular hope for a long time. Ethan turned back. He folded the letter with hands that were not entirely steady and put it in his coat pocket. 12 days, he said. "Yes." "Denver." "Yes." "We need to prepare." He looked at her. "Hart will present the documentation, but the commission will have questions about the operation of the ranch, about the circumstances here." He paused. "About you." "I know. Are you willing to go to testify if they ask?" She looked at him steadily. "I told you on the first day. I'm decided. That hasn't changed." Something moved through his eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the letter again, not to read it, just to hold it. The letter that said, "Maybe." The letter that said, "Alive." "Clara," he said. And the way he said her name this time was different from every other time. There was no transaction in it, no management. Just the word and her name inside it, and something underneath that neither of them were ready to look at directly yet, but that was there regardless, as undeniable as the mountain they were standing on. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. "Breakfast will be late tomorrow," she said. "We have preparing to do tonight." He almost smiled. It was the closest he had come to it, a movement at the corner of his mouth that lasted less than a second and cost him nothing, and gave her everything. "Yes," he said. "We do." She turned and went inside. Behind her, she heard him call to Tommy, heard the ranch resume its work, heard the ordinary sounds of a place that was fighting to remain itself. She went to the kitchen and started the fire, and began to think through what needed to be said in front of a state land commission, and how a woman who had arrived on a mountain with 43 cents and a folded letter would make the case for a ranch that had become, without her quite noticing the exact moment it happened, something worth fighting for. Not the land, the people on it. She put the water on to boil and got to work. They left for Denver at first light on the 10th day, which gave them 2 days of travel and one morning to meet with Hart before the commission hearing. Ethan rode. Clara took the wagon with the document case across her knees. Nathan's letters, the deed. Hart's correspondence. The employment papers Hart had drawn up and Ethan had signed the night before Hart left for Denver, witnessed by Hector and Pete both. Hector stayed behind to run the ranch. Before they left, he stood at the wagon and looked up at Clara with the particular expression of a man who does not say much but means everything he says. "You bring it home," he said. "We will," she said. Tommy Ellers was at the gate when they rode out. He didn't say anything. He just lifted his hand, and Ethan nodded, and Clara nodded back. And then they were on the mountain road, heading down toward the valley, and the train line that would take them to Denver. They didn't talk much in the first hours. The road demanded attention, and the cold demanded endurance, and besides, they had spent the previous 3 nights going over documents and arguments until both of them could recite the timeline of Dillard's land acquisitions from memory. There was nothing left to prepare that words could accomplish. It was somewhere in the second hour when the road leveled out and the horses found their rhythm that Ethan said, "Tell me something that has nothing to do with Dillard or the commission." She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead, his profile sharp in the cold morning light. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "Anything. Something true." He paused. "Where did you grow up?" "Wichita," she said. "My father worked the rail yards. My mother died when I was 9. I raised my brothers until I was old enough to go to the mill, and then I went to the mill." She paused. "It's not a complicated story." "Most true things aren't," he said. She watched him for a moment. "What about you?" Pete says you used to race your horse on the Ridge Road." Something moved in his face. "Pete talks too much." "Pete talks exactly the right amount," she said. "He says what needs saying and nothing else. That's rare." A pause. "I grew up here," Ethan said. "Same mountain, same ranch. My father built the main house with his own hands, and Nathan and I grew up helping him finish it. Every board in that house I remember nailing." He was quiet for a moment. "My father died when I was 22. Nathan was 19. We ran it together after that." Another pause longer. Then Margaret came. And then she didn't. He said it plainly, without performance, and she understood that this was how he carried it, not by dramatizing it, but by stating it. The thing happened. She was here. Then she wasn't. The plain words were heavier than any elaboration would have been. "I'm sorry," Clara said. 8 years ago," he said. "You'd think—" He stopped. "You'd think it would get smaller," she said quietly. "It doesn't get smaller. You just get larger around it." He looked at her, then a quick sideways look, and something in it was so direct and unguarded that she felt it land somewhere she wasn't quite prepared for. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was nothing like the silences of their first days. This one had warmth in it. The warmth of 2 people who have told each other true things and survived the telling. Denver was noise and crowd, and the particular smell of a city that was building itself faster than it could think, lumber and coal smoke, and horse and ambition all compressed together. Clara had been to cities before Wichita, briefly Kansas City. But she watched Ethan navigate Denver with the careful attention of a mountain man, in a place that moved at a different speed than he was built for, and something about that careful attention made her feel oddly protective of him. Hart met them at the hotel he'd arranged modest clean near the commission building, and he came down to the lobby with the focused energy of a man in the final hours before something he'd been working toward for a long time. He shook Ethan's hand. He looked at Clara and said, "You need to know what tomorrow will look like." "Tell us," she said. He told them. The commission panel was 3 members, a chairman, and 2 commissioners appointed by the state. The hearing was formal, but not a trial. Evidence was presented, witnesses were heard, arguments were made. Hart would present the case for Coal Ridge and the pattern of Dillard's land acquisition scheme. Dillard's company had retained their own attorney, a man named Forsyth from Denver, who was good and who would be aggressive. How aggressive? Ethan asked. He will attack the credibility of every witness and every document, Hart said. He will argue that Nathan's disappearance is unrelated to the land dispute. He will argue that my other witnesses, Griggs and Caffey, are disgruntled sellers who regret their decisions. And he will argue— He looked at Clara directly— that Miss Whitmore's presence at Coal Ridge and her involvement in the preparation of this case represents a conflict of interest and a manipulation of the process. On what grounds? She said. That you are a woman who arrived under irregular circumstances with no formal claim to the property, who has positioned herself as an interested party in order to secure her own standing. He paused. It's not a legal argument. It's a character argument. Forsyth is very good at those because the commissioners are human beings, and human beings respond to narrative. Then we give them a better narrative, Clara said. Hart looked at her. That is precisely what I intend to do, which is why I need to know, is there anything at all in your history or your conduct since arriving at Coal Ridge that Forsyth could use? Anything that could be construed even unfairly as, no, Ethan said. The single word was flat and final and carried absolute conviction. Hart looked at him, then at her. No, Clara said. Good, Hart said. Then we're ready. The commission room was large and formal, with 3 men seated at an elevated bench and a long table on each side for the opposing parties. Clara sat beside Ethan behind Hart's table. Dillard sat across the room with his attorney Forsyth, a tall man with a precise manner and eyes that were never still. Dillard looked at Clara when she came in. The look lasted exactly long enough to communicate that he had not forgotten their exchange in the Coal Ridge kitchen and had been thinking about it since. She looked back at him with complete steadiness until he looked away first. The chairman called the session to order. Hart rose and laid out the case in 22 minutes of clean documented argument. The timeline of the company's acquisition attempts the pressure applied to 3 ranches. The disappearance of Nathan Cole following his refusal to sell the missing land office records, the court petition filed before Dillard had even visited Coal Ridge to make his offer. The commissioners listened. They made notes. They asked questions that were sharp and specific, which Hart answered with equal sharpness. Then Forsyth rose. He was good. Hart had not overstated it. He dismantled things methodically. Picking at the edges of each piece of evidence, the land office records were missing due to a clerical reorganization, which was regrettable but not sinister. The other ranchers had sold freely, and whatever private complaints they had now did not constitute evidence of coercion. Nathan Cole's disappearance was a matter for the sheriff, not a land commission. And then he turned to Clara. The commission should be aware. Forsyth said, his voice carrying the particular reasonableness of a man making an unreasonable point of the nature of the witness who has been central to the preparation of this case. He paused. Miss Clara Whitmore arrived at Coal Ridge Ranch approximately 3 weeks ago under an arrangement made by the absent Nathan Cole, who engaged her through a mail-order correspondence service. He let that sit for a moment. She has no legal standing on the property. She has no formal family connection to either Cole brother. Her presence at the ranch and her involvement in compiling the documentation presented here today raises serious questions about the integrity of this process, specifically whether this case has been constructed, at least in part, to serve the personal interests of a woman whose own position becomes more secure if the ranch remains in Cole hands. One of the commissioners looked up. Is Miss Whitmore a named party in this proceeding? She is not, Hart said, rising. She is a witness and a supporting party, as is the ranch foreman Hector Reyes and other Coal Ridge employees. Mr. Forsyth is attempting to redirect the commission's attention from documented evidence of fraudulent land acquisition to a personal attack on a private individual who is not on trial here. She's not on trial, Forsyth said smoothly. I'm simply noting that the commission should weigh the motivations of those who assembled this case. The chairman said, Is Miss Whitmore available to speak? Hart said, She is. Ethan looked at her. His jaw was tight, his eyes direct and asking a question that had nothing to do with tactics. It was asking whether she was all right, whether she needed anything, whether he should do something. She shook her head slightly. A small movement. Enough. She stood up. The commissioner who questioned her was a heavy-set man named Aldridge, with the careful manner of someone who had spent decades separating truth from performance. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "Mr. Forsyth has suggested that your involvement in this case may be motivated by self-interest. How would you respond to that?" "I'd say that self-interest and doing the right thing are not mutually exclusive," she said. Her voice was even and clear and carried to every corner of the room. "I arrived at Coal Ridge Ranch with nothing. No money, no family, no legal claim to anything. The only thing I had was the ability to work and the willingness to do it honestly. If I had been calculating about my own position, the self-interested choice would have been to do nothing, to stay in the kitchen, keep my head down, and avoid drawing any attention to myself at all." She paused. "Instead, I helped compile documentation of a fraud that is hurting people who worked their whole lives for what they have. I did that because it was right. Whether it also benefits me is a separate question, and not one I'm ashamed of." Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. "Are you prepared to testify under oath that the documents presented today are accurate to your knowledge?" "Yes." "And that your account of Mr. Dillard's visit to Coal Ridge, including his statements regarding Miss Whitmore's position and the implied threat to the ranch's legal standing, is accurate?" "Yes." He wrote something down. "Thank you." She sat down. Under the table, she felt Ethan's hand close briefly over hers. Not a gesture of romance, not a performance, just a man telling someone they weren't alone. She didn't look at him. She just turned her hand slightly so that her fingers rested against his for a moment, before they both straightened. Forsyth requested a rebuttal. The chairman allowed 5 minutes. Forsyth spoke for 4 of them, and what he said was technically an argument about evidentiary standards, but what it actually was, and everyone in the room who was paying attention, understood this was a final attempt to make Clara Whitmore seem small enough to dismiss. He used the word unsuitable twice. He used the phrase irregular arrangement 3 times. The chairman let him finish. "Chairman." Then the first commissioner said, "Mr. Forsyth, in your characterization of Miss Whitmore's situation, you described her original arrangement at Coal Ridge as irregular. Would you describe the land acquisition methods of your client as regular?" A silence. Forsyth said, "The company has operated entirely within Bitte. Because I have here," the commissioner continued, as though Forsyth hadn't spoken, "a signed statement from Harlan Griggs describing a conversation in which a representative of your client's company told him that his wife would regret it if he didn't sign the sale agreement." He set the paper down. "I also have a statement from Burl Caffey describing an incident in which his fence line was cut 3 times in 2 weeks, immediately following his refusal of your client's offer before he sold." He looked at Forsyth over his glasses. "Which of those would you like to address first?" Forsyth opened his mouth. "Because we can take them in any order you prefer," the commissioner said. The commission recessed at midday. Hart came to them in the corridor with the controlled expression of a man who was not going to allow himself to be optimistic out loud because he had been in enough hearings to know that certainty was a liability. "It's going well," he said. "I want to be careful how I say that, but it's going well." "Forsyth is going to call Dillard," Ethan said. "Yes, this afternoon." "What will he say?" "Everything they planned for him to say. That the acquisition process was lawful, the offers were fair. The petition about Coal Ridge was a legitimate legal step." Hart paused. "But the Griggs and Caffey statements are in the record now. Forsyth can't undo that. And Nathan's letter." He stopped. He reached into the document case and produced a single folded sheet. "I received this morning, before the session. I didn't have time to tell you." Ethan took it. He read it. And then something happened to his face that Clara had not seen before and would not forget, not breaking, not relief exactly. But the sudden exhalation of a man who had been holding his breath for so long, he'd forgotten he was doing it. He handed it to her without speaking. It was from Hart's contact in Laramie. Nathan Cole had been found. He was alive and injured. He had been attacked on the road from the land office 2 months ago, left for dead, and had been recovering in a rooming house in Laramie under the care of a doctor who had not known who he was. He was weak but coherent. He had given Hart's contact a statement. The statement was attached. In Nathan Cole's own handwriting, shakier than the letters she'd read in the study, but his, it said, "I was followed from the land office meeting." 2 men. I don't know their names, but I would recognize their faces. Dillard was at that meeting. He was the company representative. He told me directly that men who created problems for business interests had a way of becoming problems themselves. I understood what he meant. I rode out fast, and they caught me on the Ridge Road anyway. I thought I was dead. I woke up in Wyoming, and I've been trying to get well enough to come home. Tell my brother I'm coming. Tell him I'm sorry I didn't tell him sooner. And if there's a woman named Clara Whitmore at the ranch, tell her she picked the right place to land. Clara read the last line twice. She folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Ethan. He needs to be here, Ethan said to Hart. His testimony. I've already sent a wire to Laramie, Hart said. If he's strong enough to travel, he can be here by tomorrow morning. The commission can be asked to continue the session. He paused. But even if he can't come, this statement in his handwriting describing the attack and naming Dillard as the company representative at the meeting that goes into the record this afternoon. It changes everything, Clara said. It confirms everything, Hart corrected gently. There's a difference. We already had the pieces. This is Nathan telling us we assembled them correctly. He looked at Ethan. Are you all right? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, he said he's sorry he didn't tell me sooner. Yes. He was protecting me, Ethan said. And it almost got him killed. Neither Hart nor Clara spoke. He knows me too well, Ethan said. And there was something in those 4 words that was both grief and love, and the complicated tenderness of 2 brothers who had raised each other and known each other's limits for 30 years. He knew what I'd do. And what would you have done? Clara asked quietly. He looked at her. The look was direct and honest, and not something he was managing. Exactly what would have gotten me killed or imprisoned, he said. And Nathan knew it. He exhaled slowly. He took it on himself so I could stay on the ranch and keep it running. He was solving the legal problem so I wouldn't solve it the other way. He believed in you enough to protect you, she said. And he believed in the right way to fight. Ethan was quiet. Then very quietly. He was right. The afternoon session was the turning point, though it didn't announce itself as such. Forsyth called Dillard. Dillard testified with the smooth competence of a man who had been in difficult rooms before and knew how to occupy them without appearing threatened. He was reasonable and specific and careful. Then Hart rose for cross-examination. He asked Dillard about the September meeting. Dillard confirmed he had been the company representative. He asked Dillard what had been discussed. Dillard described an offer, a refusal, a professional parting. Then Hart placed Nathan's statement on the record and read the relevant section aloud, the part where Nathan described Dillard's words directly. Men who created problems for business interests had a way of becoming problems themselves. The room went still. Dillard said, "That's not an accurate account of what I said." "You're saying Mr. Cole fabricated this statement," Hart said. "I'm saying his recollection is mistaken." "He was attacked on the Ridge Road leaving that meeting," Hart said. "Left for dead, recovered in Wyoming for 2 months. You're saying his recollection of what you said in that meeting is mistaken." "I had nothing to do with what happened to Nathan Cole." "Then you'll have no objection," Hart said, "to the commission subpoenaing the records of your company's payments to any individuals in Ridgeback County for the period August through October of this year." A pause. Small. But the commissioners saw it. Clara saw it. Everyone in the room saw the half-second calculation in Dillard's eyes before he said, "Of course not." "Thank you," Hart said. No further questions. Forsyth asked for a recess. The chairman granted 20 minutes. During the recess, Clara watched Dillard and Forsyth in the far corner of the corridor. She couldn't hear them. She didn't need to. She could read the shape of the conversation, the sharp, abbreviated gestures of a man being told something had gone wrong, the stiffening of a lawyer who was revising his strategy in real time. Ethan stood beside her. He was watching too. "He knows," Ethan said. "He knew when Hart read the statement," she said. "The question is, how much he exposes trying to fight it." Ethan looked at her. "You've been reading people your whole life." "I've had to," she said simply. "So have I," he said. "I just didn't get as good at it." He paused. "You're better at this than I am. The reading, the patience, knowing when to speak and when to wait. You're better at the other part," she said, standing at a fence line and saying two words that make men reconsider their choices. He almost smiled. "We make a reasonable team." "We do," she said. Neither of them added anything to that. They didn't need to. The hearing resumed. The chairman announced that given the new evidence entered into the record, Nathan Cole's statement, the Griggs and Caffey affidavits, the timeline of the acquisition campaign, the commission was prepared to issue a preliminary injunction, immediately suspending any county court proceedings related to Cole Ridge Ranch, pending full investigation of the company's land acquisition practices in the county. The formal investigation would take months. The preliminary injunction took effect today. Dillard did not look at anyone when it was read. He gathered his papers with the controlled movements of a man who was already calculating his next position. Forsyth spoke quietly into his ear. They left together without speaking to anyone. The chairman also noted that given the statement from Nathan Cole identifying a company representative as having made veiled threats at the September meeting, the commission was referring the matter to the state attorney's office for review of potential criminal conduct. Hart was on his feet. The commission should also know that Nathan Cole, primary deed holder of Cole Ridge Ranch, is alive and recovering in Laramie, Wyoming. We anticipate his return to Colorado within the week. The chairman looked up from his papers. "That is significant information, Mr. Hart." "Yes," Hart said. "It is." After the session ended, after the commissioners filed out, after Hart spent 20 minutes in rapid conversation with a commission clerk about the injunction paperwork, there was a moment when the room had mostly emptied and Ethan and Clara were standing at the table gathering documents in a silence that was enormous and full. Ethan picked up Nathan's statement. He held it for a moment without looking at it. Then he carefully folded it and put it in his breast pocket close. "Let's go home," he said. She looked at him. The words settled in her chest with the particular weight of things that are true. "Yes," she said. "Let's." They walked out of the commission building into the cold Denver air, and she didn't think about Dillard or Forsyth, or injunctions or legal proceedings or any of the machinery that had consumed the past weeks. She thought about Hector at the gate. She thought about Pete with his coffee and his careful words. She thought about Tommy Ellers and Big Bill's pine cones and the kitchen fire that she had rebuilt every morning from nothing into something warm. She thought about Nathan Cole somewhere in Wyoming writing a shaky letter that ended with her name. She thought about Ethan walking beside her close enough that their arms almost touched and not moving away. The train back to Ridgeback left in the morning. Tonight there was a meal and rest, and the particular quiet of people who have done a hard thing and come through it. Tomorrow there was home. The train back to Ridgeback left Denver at 7 in the morning, and by the time it cleared the city and began climbing into the mountain country, Clara had stopped pretending she was going to sleep and simply watched the world move past and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. They had won. Not finally. Hart had been careful to say that precise about it, the way he was precise about everything. The investigation would take months. Dillard's company had resources and lawyers and the particular resilience of institutions that have survived scrutiny before. There would be more hearings, more filings, more of the slow machinery of justice doing its grinding work. But Cole Ridge was protected. The injunction held. And somewhere in Wyoming, Nathan Cole was alive and getting stronger, and had written her name in a shaky hand at the end of a letter. She folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window and allowed herself for the first time in weeks to be still. Ethan was across from her. He'd been quiet since they boarded, the particular quiet of a man processing something large. He was watching the landscape with the focused attention of a person recognizing home from a distance, the specific quality of the rock, the angle of the ridges, the way the sky sat differently here than anywhere else. After a while, he said without turning from the window, "When Nathan comes back." She waited. "Things will change," he said. "The arrangement, what it was, what it is now, it'll need to be addressed." He paused. "I want to address it clearly, before he gets here, not after." "What do you want to say?" she asked. He turned from the window then and looked at her directly. "That you didn't come to Coal Ridge for me. You came for Nathan for a life he offered you, and then Nathan was gone, and you stayed anyway for reasons that were yours. I don't take credit for that. I don't want you to feel—" He stopped. Chose again. "I don't want what happens next to feel like something circumstances decided instead of something you chose." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The train moved around them, rattling and steady, climbing its mountain grade. "Ethan," she said, "I have been making choices my entire life inside circumstances I didn't pick. I know the difference between what I'm doing, because I have no option, and what I'm doing, because I want to." She held his gaze. "I know the difference." He was quiet. "Do you?" she asked. Something shifted in him. The last of the managed distance, the careful architecture of a man who had decided protection was the same as living. She watched it move, not collapse, just move aside, the way furniture moves when a room is being reconfigured for actual use. "Yes," he said, "I know the difference." "Then we don't need to wait for Nathan to sort it out," she said. "It's already sorted." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned back to the window, but something in his posture had changed, less held, less braced. Like a man who has set down something heavy and is still surprised by how much lighter his hands feel. "Hector is going to be insufferable," he said. She laughed. It came out before she could manage it, a real laugh, unguarded, and it surprised them both. "Tommy will be worse," she said. "Tommy will probably cry," Ethan said, and the corner of his mouth moved, that almost smile she had been cataloging since the first week. And this time it completed itself full, real arrived, and it changed his face so completely that she understood why Pete had said he used to race horses on the Ridge Road. The man who had done that was still in there, had been in there the whole time, waiting for enough safety to come out. Hector met them at the Ridgeback station with the wagon, and Clara saw him assess them both in one quick look from the wagon seat and arrive at a conclusion that he kept to himself with the professional discretion of a man who understood that some things are not his to announce. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Injunction granted," Ethan said. "Criminal referral filed. Investigation ongoing." Hector nodded once, the slow, weighted nod of a man receiving something he'd been holding his breath for. "Nathan? Alive. Coming home within the week." Hector closed his eyes for 1 second. 1 second, that was all. Then he opened them and said, "Tommy's been cooking." "How bad?" Clara asked. "The beans were gray," Hector said. "I don't know how you make beans gray." She climbed up onto the wagon. "I'll fix it." Same. The ranch received them, the way places receive people who belong to them, with work already waiting. With the ordinary demands of animals and land and maintenance that don't pause for legal victories. The horses needed attention. The north fence had come down again in a wind. Tommy's gray beans needed to be quietly retired and replaced with something edible. But first, in the yard, with the whole crew assembled, Hector, Tommy, Big Bill, Old Pete, the other men whose faces she now knew as well as she knew any faces in the world, Ethan stood and told them simply what had happened. The injunction, Nathan's survival, what came next. The men were quiet when he finished. Then Big Bill Marsh, who had not spoken more than 20 words to Clara in the entire month she'd been at Coal Ridge, walked up to her and held out his hand. She shook it. He nodded once with the grave formality of a large man making a small gesture that meant everything, and then he went back to his post. Tommy, as predicted, had to turn away for a moment and do something unnecessary with his hat. Pete found her later in the kitchen, which was his way. He always found her in the kitchen, and she had come to understand that the kitchen was where he went when something needed to be said without witnesses. "I knew it would work out," he said. He sat down in his chair and accepted the coffee she poured without being asked. "I didn't know how, but I knew." "You couldn't have known," she said. "I knew when I saw you that first week," he said. "You didn't complain. Not once. Not when the room was cold. Not when the men were rude. Not when Ethan—" He paused. "Not when it was hard. And I've seen a lot of people come through hard places. The ones who don't complain aren't the ones who aren't suffering. They're the ones who decided the suffering wasn't the point." He turned his cup in his hands. "You decided that the first day." She looked at him. "Pete, did you know about Nathan that he was likely still alive?" He was quiet for a moment. "I hoped," he said carefully. "Nathan's not the kind of man who dies easy. He's too stubborn." A pause. "And I may have, when Hart's rider came through 2 weeks ago, I may have heard something that I didn't pass along because I didn't want anyone building on hope that might not hold." "You were protecting them," she said. "I was protecting him," Pete said, meaning Ethan, and they both understood exactly what that meant and why it had been the right call. He'd lost enough already. I wasn't going to let him lose a second time if the first version turned out to be true. She sat down across from him. "He's going to be all right, Pete." Pete looked at her over his coffee cup with the eyes of a man who has watched a family for 30 years. "He already is," he said. "He just doesn't know it yet." Nathan Cole came home on a Wednesday. He arrived on horseback, which surprised everyone because the last report from Laramie had him still too weak to travel hard. But Nathan had apparently decided that 2 months in a rooming house in Wyoming was sufficient recovery time regardless of what the doctor said, and he'd ridden south across the state line with a man Hart had sent to accompany him, and he came up the mountain road at a walk that was slow but steady, and Ethan met him at the gate. Clara stayed on the porch. She watched the two brothers meet, and she gave them the privacy of distance, not looking away, because that would have been its own kind of intrusion, but going still, letting the moment be theirs. Ethan put his hand on Nathan's shoulder. Nathan put his hand on Ethan's arm. They stood like that for a long moment, not speaking, just present with each other in the particular way of people who have been frightened for each other and are now adjusting to the relief. Then Nathan looked toward the house. He looked directly at Clara across the yard with the clear, deliberate focus of a man who had been thinking about this moment for a long time. He was thinner than she'd imagined, and the ride had cost him. She could see it in how carefully he dismounted, but his eyes were exactly what she would have predicted from his letter. Steady and warm and honest and slightly amused, the eyes of a man who met the world with goodwill and expected the same in return. He walked toward her. Ethan walked beside him at the pace Nathan set, which was slower than Ethan's natural stride, and the adjustment told her everything she needed to know about who these brothers were to each other. Nathan stopped at the foot of the porch steps. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Cole," she said. "You look better than I expected." "I look terrible, and we both know it," he said. "I also know what you did. Hart told me everything." He paused. "I owe you more than I can say." "You owe me a decent letter of employment," she said, "which your brother has already provided. So we're even." Nathan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan, then back at her. The look he gave his brother was brief and entirely legible. The look of a man who wrote a letter to a woman in Kansas and is now observing the unintended consequences of that letter with considerable satisfaction. Ethan looked back at him with an expression that said clearly, "Say nothing." Nathan pressed his lips together against something and said with great dignity, "I'd like to sit down." "Kitchen," Clara said. "I have soup on." "God bless you," Nathan said, and meant it on multiple levels, and climbed the porch steps. The days that followed had a different quality than any that had come before. Not easier necessarily. The ranch work didn't lighten, and Hart sent regular updates from Denver that required attention and response, and the formal investigation meant paperwork and correspondence that fell largely to Clara, because her handwriting was clearest and her organizational mind was, as Hart had noted in his dry way, substantially more efficient than anyone else's at Coal Ridge. But the quality of the days was different, warmer, more settled, the feeling of a place that knows what it is and has stopped arguing about it. Nathan recovered with the stubborn speed of a man who felt guilty about having been absent and was compensating through effort. Within 10 days, he was back at the fence lines. Within 2 weeks, he was riding the full property. He had a long conversation with Ethan that neither of them reported to anyone else. And afterward, both brothers were slightly different, not in obvious ways, but in the way that people are different after an honest conversation that cost them both something and gave them more back than they spent. Nathan also had a conversation with Clara. He found her in the study, his study, though she still thought of it slightly as the room where she and Ethan had read his letters by firelight, and he knocked on the open door and stood there with the particular posture of a man who has rehearsed something and is hoping the rehearsal was adequate. "Can I come in?" he asked. "It's your study," she said. It doesn't feel entirely like mine anymore," he said. "I mean that as a compliment." He came in and sat down across from her the way Ethan sat across from her, and she thought about how different the two brothers were, and how the same fundamental decency running through both of them like a seam of good rock through a mountain. "I want to say something, and I want to say it clearly," Nathan said. "What I offered you in that letter, a home, a partnership, an arrangement, I offered it in good faith, and I stand by it. You are welcome at Coal Ridge for as long as you want to be here under any terms that suit you, regardless of anything else." He paused. "I also want you to know that I am completely aware of what has happened while I was gone, and I want to be careful here, I have no claim on you. I never did, really. A letter isn't a claim. It's an invitation." He looked at her directly. "And invitations can be accepted in ways the person who wrote them didn't anticipate. That's not wrong. That's just how things go sometimes." She looked at him for a moment. "Nathan, are you giving me permission to have feelings for your brother?" He considered this. "I'm trying to make sure you know you don't need my permission. There's a difference." "There is," she agreed. "He's not easy," Nathan said. "I know. He will never be easy. He's been difficult since he was 6 years old, and he's not going to reform at 35. "I'm not looking for easy," she said. "I had easy once briefly, and it turned out to be nothing. I'll take real over easy every time." Nathan looked at her for a long moment with those honest, slightly amused eyes. "He's going to make you say everything directly," he said. "He doesn't do inference. You'll have to tell him exactly what you mean every time." "I've noticed," she said. "And you're all right with that. I think," she said, "that I've spent enough of my life inferring things that were never said and managing things that were never acknowledged. Being with someone who needs directness is not a burden. It's a relief." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then, "I wrote that letter to 40 women, he said. She blinked. "I answered 40 advertisements," he said. "Mine went to 40 women. You were the only one who wrote back." He paused. "I used to think that was just chance. Now I think the letter got where it was supposed to go." She didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. She looked down at the papers on the desk and felt something in her chest that was too large and too full to name the particular feeling of a life that has found its shape after a long time of having none. "Thank you," she said, "for writing it." "Thank you," he said, "for answering." That evening, after supper, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and Nathan had gone to bed early because 2 weeks of pushing himself had finally caught up with him, Clara was in the kitchen when Ethan came in. He stood in the doorway, in the way she had memorized that particular quality of his presence, filling the frame without demanding the room. "Sit down," she said. "I'll pour coffee." He sat at the kitchen table. She poured and sat across from him, and they were quiet for a moment in the way they were quiet together, which was nothing like silence. "Nathan talked to you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." What did he say? Mostly that you're difficult and have been since you were 6. He's not wrong. Ethan turned his coffee cup. What else? She looked at him. He said I don't need permission. Ethan was still. He was right about that too, she said. A long moment passed. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Outside, the wind moved around the corners of the house that Ethan's father had built with his own hands, the house Ethan had grown up in, the house that had nearly been taken, and hadn't been. I asked you to stay for 1 week, Ethan said. She recognized it. He was beginning somewhere deliberate, not the beginning of the sentence, but the beginning of the thing the sentence was pointing at. You did, she said. You stayed past the week. I did. You stayed through Dillard and the filing and Denver and Nathan coming home. He paused. And you're still here? Yes, she said. He looked at her. The gray eyes were entirely open. No architecture, no managed distance, no careful positioning. Just a man looking at a woman with nothing between them except the truth of what the past weeks had built. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to say that plainly. 8 years is a long time to keep your own company, and I've gotten particular about it. I don't know if I have it in me to do this well. Ethan, she said, nobody does it well. Doing it honestly is the only thing that counts. I can do honest, he said. I know you can. It's practically all you do. That almost smile, the one that had become a real smile, came and stayed this time. You're going to keep account of everything, aren't you? Every time I do something right. Somebody should, she said, which was what she'd said to him weeks ago on the ranch in the cold, and he remembered it. She could see that he remembered it, and what it meant now was layered over what it had meant then, and both meanings were true simultaneously. He reached across the kitchen table and took her hand. Not a brief press this time, not the hidden contact under the commission table there and gone. He held it fully the way a man holds something he has decided to stop pretending he doesn't want. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm and entirely certain. Don't leave, he said. 2 words. No elaboration. No conditions. Just a man who had spent 8 years at a distance from everything that could hurt him, standing at the edge of that distance and choosing with his eyes open to close it. I wasn't going to, she said. I know, he said. I needed to say it anyway. She turned her hand in his and held on. Outside, Coal Ridge Ranch settled into its evening, the horses in their stalls, the men in their bunks. Nathan asleep for the first time in his own bed in 2 months. The mountain standing above it all in the cold dark, the way it had stood for 1,000 years and would stand for 1,000 more. Inside in a kitchen that had been dark and cold and chaotic before a woman with 43 cents and a folded letter arrived and rebuilt it from nothing. 2 people sat across a table and held on to each other with the simple, total, completely deliberate certainty of people who have fought for the same thing long enough to know it's worth keeping. Clara Whitmore had come to Colorado Territory with nothing but the willingness to work and the refusal to be moved by the expectation that she would break. She had not broken. She had built something instead. A kitchen, a case, a life. A man who was learning to open the windows of the house he'd sealed against the world. And when she looked at Ethan Cole across that table at his certain hands and his open eyes, and the face that had finally stopped protecting itself from her, she understood something she had not let herself understand until now. She had not landed at Coal Ridge Ranch by accident or misfortune or the cruel indifference of circumstance. She had landed exactly where she was supposed to be. And she was never leaving again.